Jen Williams, thanks for joining us on the podcast today. You're Deputy Executive Director for the Property Council in Queensland.
Correct.
Before we turn the microphone on today, you're sharing some interesting background of yours at how you came to your current position. Could you share that with us? I thought that was really interesting.
You want the whole journey, or would you like the abbreviated
condense it
journey?
down, but
Sure. I have worked in many different roles and never knew what I wanted to be or what I wanted to do. So finished school, I studied social science, worked in market research in the city in an office, and hated every minute of it and decided I never wanted to work in an office again. So then I went and studied a Bachelor of Education because I thought teachers don't have to be in an office.
Mm-hmm.
After that, I taught for about 3.5 years, most of that in North Queensland. During that time, I studied a Masters of Management as well. So finished up my country service of teaching and decided to move back to Brisbane, newly minted with my master's degree.
Mm-hmm.
Again, didn't know what to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually started working for a federal politician, became an advisor in federal politics. Did that until Kevin 07 rocked the boat a bit.
Right.
Lost my job.
Mm-hmm.
That was fine. I went to work for a developer for 1.5 years after that. Then the GFC hit, so not too much work for developers around that time. Went back to teaching. And then I got a call from Amanda Cooper in Brisbane City Council a couple of years later, and she asked me to come work with her on as a planning advisor.
Mm-hmm.
So I went and did that for a while. I was there for a year, and I met the team at the Property Council, and I absolutely loved them. So after meeting them for a few times, I rang up Kathy McDermott, who was then the Queensland Executive Director, and said, "Do you have a job?" And she's like, "I'm pretty sure I can make one for you." So then I started the Property Council as a policy advisor, and I've been there for almost 9 years.
Wow. And so was it the connection with the people that made you say, I want to work for the Property Council?
Absolutely.
More so than, because if you go back and you look at the different elements of your sort of different careers before coming to the Property Council, they all are, if you look at what you're doing now, quite complementary or quite valuable. I can't imagine you've left a lot of those learnings behind.
No, everything that I've done has built on the thing before it, but it's all very much been people-based. So every time it's been somebody who I've met has said, "Do you want to come work for me?" Or I've seen somebody, met them and thought, "I really like the way you operate. I'd like to work with you,"
Mm-hmm.
and approached them.
Yep. And just seemed to stick.
And it just seemed to stick. And the Property Council, this is the best job in the world. It is just this perfect blend of all sorts of different things. So it's...
So what are those things? So I think there's, again, as I've known of the Property Council for quite a long time, and it's like reminded of all the different elements of what it is that they do. Like, what are those? Unpack that for us.
What are those? So in my role, I look after our policy and advocacy work. So day to day, I could have my head stuck in legislation. Like this morning, I lodged a submission on the Environment Protection and Other Legislation Amendment Bill.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes it's like being a nerd, sitting there, trolling through legislation, dealing with the lawyers. So that satisfies like part of my brain.
A joy, no doubt.
It is a
yes.
joy. Very good friends of mine. But then there's other bits of it. So we run, I think we have 14 industry committees in Queensland. So each one of them has about 20 industry reps on there. So they're a cross-section of the industry.
Mm-hmm.
So you get to meet with them every month and chat to them about what they're doing, what we can do for them, which is just amazing. And then as well, we have our events, which is a big part of our focus. And I'm sure we'll come to a bit later as well.
Yep.
So they did range from 6 people up to 1,800 people.
Mm-hmm.
So huge spectrum. And, part of my role is to help come up with the ideas, speakers, topics for those events.
And is it through the committees that things like, and I'm sure I'm getting this description wrong, but the benchmarking for different asset classes like premium, A grade, all that comes through, that work comes through the committees as well?
It does.
Because that's also a question I have a bit later as to how this current state of affairs is going to impact on those things.
So the Property Council, so we're a national organisation. So I work in Queensland, and we predominantly look after state and local based issues. We also have a national division who look after the national issues, and part of that is that we have a national research team, and so they work with our members, and they have their own set of committees as such, and they come up with like a guide to office building quality, the office market report, and our surveys and bits and pieces like that. So they take carriage of that, and then we kind of push it out through our state networks.
Excellent. The main reason why I wanted to have a chat with you is on account of the pandemic and the impact that that's had on the industry. And whilst not going to pass over what the current state of affairs is, I'm quite interested to look into the crystal ball and see what things might be temporary and what things might be permanent changes to the industry. But perhaps if we can start with the immediate impact. And I guess from a couple of levels. So I'm interested to know I'm sure you've heard loud and clear what the feedback from the membership is, and I'd be interested to hear what that is, and I'll sort of not be too specific about sort of what particular aspect of it. But one thing I was interested to understand is, given the diversity of the membership in the Property Council, from the biggest of organisations down to quite small organisations, perhaps how that feedback differs across that spectrum.
So feedback in terms of the pandemic, or how we connect with them? No,
just in the impact on the business of of the membership of the Property Council
from the pandemic itself. So I guess, like you say, our membership ranges. So we have sole operators through to the biggest property companies in the country. Some of them are doing quite well at this point in time. Others not so well at all. We have continued to run all of our industry committees, so via Teams. We've also run live stream events to help us gather feedback from our members on how they're going and how we can help them. So across the different sectors, they've all been impacted in different ways, and some of them will be impacted further down the track as opposed to right now. So obviously people, retail tenants, they're hurting pretty bad at this point. Offices, you look at the CBD.
Very quiet.
Very quiet. When are people returning to the office? Are people returning to the office? Are they just going to come and go? Are they going to drive? Are they? So I guess, depending on which sector you look at, it's all been very different. We've had the I can't think of it, the home builder, which has helped our residential members, and some of our retirement living members are able to access that as well. Some of our smaller operators in the comms field, they've never been busier in their lives as they're trying to help out some of the other members in, advertising, home builder and the like, and getting stuff through the door. So it's been really an interesting time. So people have, called us with urgent issues on the spot. So things like, dealing with the commercial code of conduct and how to implement that. And then we've had others saying, can you give us any insights? When are people coming back to the office? What do I need to do to make my office COVID safe? How do I engage with my landlord? I'm a landlord. How do I engage with my tenants?
And so is it a bit early, do you think, to see, because, and I want to talk about the code of conduct, but it's really been dealing with that immediate impact of how to sort of, and perhaps if I can just sort of selfishly look at the leasing, the leasing market, looking at what measures can be put in place for sort of temporary relief, whether in accordance with the code of conduct they fell under that, or otherwise. So has it been more focused on those immediate things, and it's still too early to get a sense of how things are going to shake out?
I think it's definitely too early to understand how it's going to shake out, but people are very keen to look beyond the health emergency. So, early on, people just wanted to connect with one another and find out who was doing what, which video conferencing platform was best to use with your teams. Like, how do I negotiate with my tenants? Whereas now they're looking bigger picture and further out and wondering, my books might have been busy up until this month. What's coming next? Or you know, what's going to happen to the CBD. So we've been able to ride out, you know, going, yes, it'll be 3 months, or, you know, the government's next stage of lockdown is going to be lifted on the 10th of July, so we can last until then, but will things return to normal then? So the questions are starting to come through. Some of our committees, like the Committee for Cities, is really focused on those big picture long-term impacts, whereas others are still, you know, there are still those who are still trying to apply for land tax relief and trying to have those conversations with their tenants. But it's mostly been in that early emergency stage up until now, when we're looking a bit further afield.
What about the Property Council itself as an organisation? Like, what was its path through all those different steps that, you know, that you were just referring to from the members, in terms of, you know, even starting back to the, you know, oh my God, how do we do this whole virtual thing?
How do we do the virtual thing? So we're really fortunate at the Property Council. So we have access to some of the most amazing minds, and just through our membership, you know, these organisations are fabulous. And so we get to see how they do everything. And so for a long time, the Property Council's been focused on having flexibility in its workplaces, so emulating what the employers of choice and the big organisations are doing. So everyone across the Property Council for the past maybe 2 years has been able to work flexibly. Everybody's had their own laptop, they've had their own wireless dongle, they can work from anywhere. So when this all came out, we were actually in a pretty good position, because we already had in place all of those tools that a lot of organisations didn't have.
Were you using them a lot? Because I asked that question because it's like Field is a distributed team, and so there's one, and so our only method of operation has been people working in different places and working remotely as a team, and also in connecting with our clients, and that's been a very big learning experience that we've gone through over many years to make that work really well. And so one thing I've observed from talking with some of our own customers is it's one thing to have the technology there. It's a wholly different situation when you're forced to use it all day, every day. Had you had some practice with that, or were you in the same boat?
Yeah, I think we were very much in the same boat. So we, particularly our policy team, because we're a membership organisation, we're out all day with our members, and we're meeting with government, and we're meeting with industry and councils. And so for any one of us to work from home, you know, you'd have to book it out 3 weeks in advance. This day, this day, do not put stuff in because I'm going to work from home. So everything we did really was face to face. And so now...
But are you still working, like, are you working on everything else but for the thing you're immediately dealing with on a remote basis, or it's not quite the same?
It's just not quite the same.
Because you're sort of jumping from one thing to the next. There's not really sort of downtime where you're sitting, busting out a laptop in some strange location, catching up on some work.
No, it doesn't really work like that. So what we ended up doing is realising, you know, well, government stopped inviting us to a lot of meetings, which was nice for a while. And then they suddenly replaced them all with, you know, virtual recovery meetings. Yeah. That's okay. But, you know, we still have less meetings now than what we did pre-COVID. So that's actually allowed us the time to connect better as a team virtually, which we'd never had to do pre-COVID. And so using Teams and such like, so we call each other quite often, and team catch-ups and things. So
let me just ask you one thing there, because I've got a bit of a theory of my own going as to the impact of this whole situation on meetings and meeting culture. Where it's one thing to be, you know, and a lot of people spend a lot of time in meetings, some good meetings, some more productive meetings, perhaps some not so. But then what I saw is that people who were tasked with that kind of role then took that and tried to transpose it into a virtual environment, and just had this burnout fatigue from Zoom meetings or whatever the platform is all day long. And all of a sudden they're stopping going, this is too many meetings, this is ridiculous. So one of my thoughts is that this will make people reflect with greater scrutiny on the value of meetings and who needs to go to them. And so I think they'll reduce. I think that'll be a longer lasting effect. I think there'll be more, and what is inherent in successful distributed workforces, and a lot of this kind of feedback comes, software development is an area that tends to do this with sort of in a more proactive way, and that there's more autonomous sort of parallel work running and less, working together all the time. So I can see some of that coming through, but then that has a really interesting flow-on effect in so many areas if people are just meeting less, whether it be from the way the organisation might work and people work together, or indeed how offices are laid out, how many meeting rooms you've got. I think it could be, the cascading effect from that could be quite significant and perhaps not appreciated. So that's one thing, that's one of my sort of crystal ball things at the moment.
Yeah, it is, absolutely, and it's a conversation that we have often. What we have found just within the property council is it's really hard to do anything creative over a virtual network.
Yes.
So when our team got together for the first time, we were back in the office last week. Got in the office, all spaced out, meter and a half
all standing
away.
on your circle on the ground.
Pretty much. But we could actually have a proper conversation and brainstorm different responses to things and build off one another, which is something that you just cannot do in a virtual environment. And so I think returning to work, so we knew that we were missing that, but actually being back in the office together, it just really brought home how important it is to be able to be face to face with your staff.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I would sort of take that a step further and go often where I think it's easy for that to spill over into everything being a discussion by meeting.
Oh, yeah.
And so perhaps, again, being more mindful about saying we get enormous value out of doing this in person. We need to maintain that because that's really important. But then we don't need to have this additional time. Like, we don't need to then go and do the thing or, in a meeting context. There's a lot more work that can be done externally. So I just think people are going to be looking with much more scrutiny there.
Because I think it goes both ways for me, because during lockdown I found that the meetings that I would set up got forwarded more often.
Yes.
And so you had more people just sitting as passive observers.
Yes, I think that will stop too. And I think that's because it becomes so much more obvious. I don't know what it is, the virtual interface and meeting with people. I think it's just harder to sit, whether you're an active or a passive participant in a meeting. It's just much harder work doing it in a virtual environment. No, I was listening to some people talking about this and just saying that the mental drain is greater because there's, I think they were saying perhaps you can't look away. There's no way of cheating the engagement there.
You don't know if you're on somebody's full screen.
It's quite obvious if you're not really participating fully.
Yeah.
So anyway.
I also find it really hard not getting immediate feedback from somebody's face. So I find it, for example, really difficult to have phone calls with people because I can't sense from looking at their face. And even just the delay of the screen or not quite being able to see somebody's face. I actually find it really quite difficult to have a genuine conversation with a person.
I think the technology is going to come in leaps and bounds in that area. So if you just look like how good is the average webcam as a camera, as a microphone, I think you'll see in the next 12 months, say new laptops coming out, everyone is going to be talking about how fantastic their new camera is and how fantastic the audio is. And they might sound like really unimportant things, but the difference between that and better quality stuff is quite significant. So I think a lot of there'll be a great democratization of technology that goes to audio and video, and I think it's quite an interesting area. And another tip in that respect, the gaming industry, like a lot of people stream gameplay, and a lot of people follow people, and it's not like I wouldn't for a second suggest I know anything about computer games. My 9-year-old thrashes me in anything he chooses to play, but there is an amazing following, and it's not just sitting there and saying I'm watching somebody else play a game. Like I'm watching someone play, rugby or cricket or whatever, and I'm marveling at their skill. It's not just that; it's the conversation that goes on at the same time, and it's more that social element. So there's a whole this enormous industry of people being able to do amazing things and connect in an online environment that sort of sits in an area that a lot of people wouldn't see. And I think a lot of that's going to become more mainstream. Like a lot of that tech and that process is going to come through with younger generation and change quite a lot of things. So
younger generation.
Well, no, I think it's easy to look. It's easy, you know, as an old person like me, to look at things and say and put your overlay on how things work. Like when people say, you know, when someone 40 plus says, I think people are going to want to do this when they come. Oh, they really need that in-person connection. They're going to want to come back to the office. Or some people will say, no one's ever going to want to come back to the office because of whatever. I think anyone making categorical statements like that without asking the generation of people that are really going to be making those decisions that are coming through now, a generation that deals with technology in an entirely different way to all of us, I think it's a bit flawed. So again, I look at that as a really interesting space. Sorry, I digress, but I think that's quite fascinating.
The same, like the generational thing is interesting. You know, big organisations like the PwCs and EYs and that of the world, you know, they surveyed their many thousands of staff about who wanted to come back into the office and who didn't, and their reasons for it. And, you know, the younger people were the ones who were keen to come back in.
Yes.
And the older generation were keen to stay home. And then in the middle was like...
Yeah, but I think it's easy to look... Like, I don't think enough thought, or perhaps not the right questions, are being asked of those younger people because, and I'm guessing here, but the people asking the questions are people not from that generation. And so, you know, how you ask the question says a lot about the information you necessarily get back. And also when you don't have an appreciation, for example, of how people in a younger cohort interact with each other socially via technology.
Yeah, what the alternatives are. Like you're giving them like
you're asking
black
them
and white
in my world, this is what it looks like. Here, give me a question, answer A, B or C.
Yeah, and they're like, what about E and F?
Yeah, exactly. So fascinating space. Anyway, I'll park that one. That's just an area that I'm quite interested in.
So do you want me to continue? So we so the property council, so we all got sent home.
Yes.
And now we're making that transition of back to the office, which has been interesting as well.
So talk to me about that, because when I spoke to you about doing this podcast, you put the hand out and said, no, you can't come into our office.
We're not allowed visitors.
Yep. And now, is that, and this perhaps is just speaking to my naivety, but is that a rule external to you guys that you can't have people in, or is that a decision that you've made? Because I have visited some offices recently.
So that's a decision of our exco.
Yes.
That, you know, we are going to do things in the safest possible way, basically. And like I said, we're a national organisation. Every office is transitioning back in a different way. So in Queensland, we've been back for 2 weeks now. So we've got an A and a B team. So one team in there Monday, Tuesday, every second Wednesday. The others Thursday, Friday.
Yes.
The other Wednesday. We're not allowed any visitors. You know, we've got all of the standard cleaning protocols, you name it. But public transport, I believe, still remains the biggest barrier to return to the office.
Yep. People just not willing to...
People don't want to go on public transport.
No.
So I think after the school holidays end here in Queensland, more people returning to the office, it's going to be a nightmare.
Certainly seen no shortage of people returning back to shopping centres recently.
Yeah.
I
think in shopping centres you can choose your distance from, you know, you can move away from them, whereas on public transport...
it certainly is different.
And we're innately polite people, you know, someone sits next to you, you're not going to ask them to move.
You wouldn't?
Maybe not.
Yeah, I've noticed, and even in myself, where I was very hesitant early on, where I just didn't understand the things, you know, where, you know, taking our kids anywhere, or certainly engaging with anyone else, grandparents and other things, you know, we're all by the book there. And then I felt in myself a great sort of release recently in sort of going back into public places, and I can sense that in others around it. It seems because, you know, there was a mantra about doing the right things so that we can sort of manage the extent to which this became a problem, to help the healthcare system, flatten the curve and all that kind of stuff. That all made sense. I think we got through it and people have thought, we've managed this quite well, whether that be by luck or by design. I'm not one to judge that. But we seem to get through it quite well, and so people go, That's cool. And now they're relaxed,
Yeah.
or much more so. Public transport's an interesting one there, though.
Yeah. And, Victoria in the past couple of days has seen those massive spikes. It'll be interesting to see the impact of that on the psyche of people in Queensland if they do start to, revert back to, the lockdown way of thinking, or if they are just going to embrace their freedom.
Yeah, that's a hard one, I think, because I think people's willingness to go back into full lockdown mode is probably not great. Mandatory code of conduct.
Yes.
Subtle shift there. Did you like that? From the outside looking in, I could see commentary that the PCA gave in response to that. Were you, or to what extent was the PCA involved in the creation of that as opposed to giving feedback on it? Like, how did that process work?
Sure. So it started with National Cabinet. So the PM said basically to the Treasurers, I want to have some principles. And so the Property Council was heavily involved at that point in dealing with all of the different states and providing our input. And kudos to Queensland Government. They listened to us and actually took the fight up to National Cabinet and put forward what we thought were some really fair principles. Unfortunately, that got rolled at the last minute, and we ended up with a set of principles which were not as equitable as we would have liked. They were very much in favour of the tenants. We did manage to work with them to wind back one of the really scary ones, which would have allowed tenants to walk away en masse. Like, that would have just been devastating for the entire economy.
And were they? Do you think they were intentional things, or do you think they were perhaps just not fully understanding?
I think that was not an intentional one. I think that they were, trying to support the tenants, but didn't quite realise the ramifications of just allowing people to just tear up their leases and head for the doors. So we did get that one back, which was great. So we ended up with a list of principles then, which the states were left to implement, and similarly with land tax relief. So the Treasurers had kind of agreed on, some principles, but then they didn't get kind of enforced across the board. So each state then had to go and work it out. Queensland was a first mover, and they did a fabulous job on the land tax relief in getting it out really quickly, and they've just extended the timeframes for it as well after we put our case to them. But then Queensland was actually one of the last states to implement its code of conduct. So they kind of sat back, they worked with us and sat back and looked at what all of the other states were doing and picked out bits and pieces from them. And we had really close engagement with them. So, probably 7 or 8 rounds of feedback on the regulations before they actually adopted it. And it's probably the fairest regulation in the country. Which is very pleasing.
So which aspects of, what are the, the handful of key items that the PCA was advocating for one position and a different position?
Sure. So the National Cabinet principles, they had in there about the extent of relief that needed to be provided, and the amount of land tax that had to be passed on. And so some of those we've been able to kind of make them more at the discretion of the landlord and tenant, so that they can actually negotiate an outcome. Some tenants don't want to be locked into something that's for the next 6 months. They might only want, 3 months, and then they'll be back on their feet and not have to worry about deferred rent. Because
that's a sleeper, that one.
It is. And so some of them recognise that, and the tenants and landlords were able to work together because there weren't the hard and fast box ticking rules that some of the other states kind of had.
But on the whole, do you think, it's again from the outside looking in, and we work almost exclusively for landlords or people that work for landlords, so we see their points of view, or we hear their points of view on that. From my perspective, looking at it, considering the amount of time and how much was unknown in the impact of these things, it seems to be relatively balanced. I mean, never perfect. Are there any?
It's never perfect. But I think you hit the nail on the head there when you said the amount of time this is an emergency and people needed relief straight away. And some of the landlords, as you would appreciate, they have thousands of tenants that they have to deal with one-on-one to understand their individual issues and to come up with a bespoke agreement for them.
But it's a proportionality in that arrangement as well, because big organisations have lots of people to manage that. And I'm not being flippant about that, but for a small owner with one building and half a dozen tenants to work through, perhaps no different challenge or perhaps a greater challenge, depends how.
And with some of the bigger ones as well, they've got different codes in different states and different requirements, and they're dealing with the same kind of it's meant to be for SMEs, but trying to make things consistent across their business so they're not favouring one over another. It was no small task, and some of them, they're still in negotiations now. Yes.
It's. I mean, as with all of these things, and any kind of all the financial stimulus measures, it's you're kicking the can down the road to a certain extent, or perhaps to a large extent, and how things unravel when some of those support mechanisms fall away will be the bigger determinant of how much of an impact the current pandemic is.
And I will say, that the property industry are the only ones who've had to put their hands in their own pocket to support another sector of the business community as well.
Well, it's a question of...
they want them to succeed, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I had thought quite a bit about that before the pandemic in the context of retail and the challenge that bricks and mortar retail has as a sector, and particularly the impact of e-commerce on bricks and mortar retail, even though all bricks and mortar retailers these days are involved in e-commerce. But there is, I looked at it as an evolution. If you're going to be cynical and say there's, an acrimonious landlord-tenant, like landlord v tenant kind of dynamic, which certainly exists in some places, that it's almost now a collective or united against a common foe. So instead of bricks and mortar landlords going against bricks and mortar tenants, it's a question of saying, well, we've got this phenomenon of e-commerce that's impacting on both of us, and perhaps now for our collective good we need to change the way in which we deal with each other so that we can best manage the impact of of this other threat. And so there's a certain sense of that for me in the pandemic, where you can look at it and saying one sector is supporting another sector, but I'm sure no major landlord is going to want to have major defaults across their...
No, absolutely not. It's in their interest to keep all of their tenants in place, for sure. Yeah,
so the next 6 to 12 months will be quite interesting. I mentioned earlier the classification system for buildings that the PCA administers, and I'm reading a lot of really interesting stuff that's coming out at the moment about how the major office landlords in particular are dealing with or are using various measures to make their buildings more able to receive people. So, contactless entry and management of lift capacity, and even before we get to office layout and all of these other things. Is there talk yet about how any of those things might start to flow into these tools? Or is it a bit early? Am I jumping the gun there?
It's a bit early on that one. So we just last year published the new Guide to Office Quality, office building quality, which is, as you know, the standard used across the country. And that was a big process to work with the landlords and their people to figure out, where we think, like predicting where buildings are going to go.
Yep.
Technology changes so much, and so we finally got that one out. So I think it will take time to work through what is best practice in terms of social distancing and bringing these things in particularly as permanent features, because that's what we're talking about, permanent features of the building, as opposed to just your hand sanitizer stations or whatever else. So I think it will take time for people to figure out what they want and what the gold standard is before that then flows through to outrating tools.
Are you getting the sense that are landlords putting their foot down on more permanent changes now, or do you think there's still some hesitation about, do we want to go and invest all of this capex on these, these new measures that maybe in a few years we look back and go, we're no longer getting value for those things?
I'd say, there are a few commercial towers under construction in the CBD at the moment, and they are looking very, very closely at what permanent things that they need to put in place. And so whether they do go over and above just to make sure.
Yep. Well, it's much more cost effective to do it before you build the thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So then there are those who've just finished buildings who may be going, how can we retrofit? What can we kind of do? But, it takes a long time to get a commercial tower out of the ground. So, they're not changes that people can very quickly just make if they're permanent.
Yeah, but I do wonder, because they'll all have their capex budgets. I wonder whether they're saying we just need to allocate, if whatever percentage was the amount of capex that we'd spend on our portfolio over the next 3 years, we're going to start to assume that we double that number, because we see that we're to keep at the to keep ahead of the curve, to keep at the sort of the competitive edge, that we're going to need to do a lot of things. We perhaps don't know exactly what those things are going to be yet, but we need to do them.
I imagine those conversations are definitely happening in-house. And as you'd appreciate, the property industry is very competitive, and there is that flight to quality. And so there's that constant trying to get the newest, latest, greatest to attract the most tenants, the best tenants.
Absolutely. No, I think that, I can just imagine things, as someone who's spent a career negotiating leases and, reflecting on times like, for example, when, the Green Star rating and the different neighbours tools have come in, but then looking at things like wellness,
definitely seeing
environment
a greater
quality,
focus on wellness,
cleaning standards. All of a sudden the negotiations are going to be going much deeper into areas that they haven't seen so much of before, and experiencing those other examples I gave is that they push the boat out quite a long way, and then sort of as people get a better understanding of how things will shake out, they become simpler in their not necessarily less stringent, but simpler in their framework. But interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
I suppose as a final element of our discussion, as I mentioned earlier, I'm keen to understand, and you mentioned the property council, a big part of its business is running events. Yeah. And I think it's a great insight into the broader challenge of the industry across a lot of different areas in dealing with this issue of lots of people close together is a problem. Certainly a problem now. To what extent it's going to remain a problem, time will tell. How has that impacted the property council in its events business, and perhaps that transition? You spoke of the transition with the office before, what happened immediately, and then talk to us a bit about that and where you see it going.
So it has been, I'm not going to lie, it's been really hard for us. So a huge proportion of our revenue comes in through events. So events basically pay to keep people like me employed to run our advocacy. In Queensland, we run circa 60 events a year, and that's just in Queensland. So you multiply that around the country, and then our national events. So it's a huge business.
And that's not 60 lunches, that's a range of things.
It's a range of things, It could be a professional development course. Our Christmas party has 1,800 people come to it. So
I remember.
Good fun. So, I mean, that's a big part of our business, and we have people employed specifically to roll out those events. So we went from running that many events to 0 in the space of 2 weeks, basically. So huge flow-on implications.
And were you involved at all in the discussions around that, or at least privy to it? Because
to be honest, I've just come back from maternity leave,
which I know.
I wasn't really around for.
But did you get some sense? Sorry, of course I knew that. But I imagine that must have been a very difficult period when, again, there was so much uncertainty around it, such a significant part of the business. These are really hard decisions to make. Are we overreacting? Are we doing the right thing when they're sort of serious existential threats for the business? Yeah. From your colleagues, have you heard much about that perhaps a week period where it...
The decisions
things
were
started
kind of
to get real.
made for us in
Yep.
terms of our members. Their businesses just said
No.
no.
Okay.
So, for example, we ran a lunch on the Gold Coast on the Thursday, and then the following week we were all at home working from home.
Right.
So our members had basically said, I'm sorry,
Yep.
we're not allowed to go to events anymore. So that made the decision for us.
Yep.
So we went very rapidly back to 0 events to help kind of fill the gap and to connect with our members, because property industry, we all love to chat to one another, as you'd appreciate. We started running national live stream events. So every 2 weeks, we'd have some of the CEOs of the big corporate leaders talking
Yep.
for an hour, which was really great for the first couple months. And then everybody
Got a
got
bit bored with that.
fatigue.
Yep.
Yeah. And that's fine, completely understand that. Consequently, though, it did mean that we had to fundamentally change our business. So we're now running an interim operating model. So all of our event staff from these different states and nationally have been reallocated to different parts of the business, or they've been stood down, which is an incredibly hard decision to make. So rather than having state-based events team, we had one online events team, and then we had innovation, sponsorship and marketing. And then the third one, there's another one that's running as well, our commercial team.
Yep.
They were allocated to that, the remaining staff. Membership renewal,
Yep.
of course. So that was a really key one for us. All of our membership renewal notices have gone out in the middle of a pandemic, which, again,
Yes.
not ideal. So the business has been running under that model with a deadline basically of September to reevaluate where we're at. In really positive news, because we've done so well in terms of, keeping the cases low, we actually are running our first face-to-face event in Queensland on the 13th of August,
Awesome.
which is the office market report. So that's very exciting. So that means we can unpick one of our staff from the national online events team to come back and help us to run that here. Going forward,
And
though,
how, I kind of ask,
yeah.
so how big will that be? What
Yeah.
restrictions will be in place for
so
that?
our events are not going to look like they used to look.
Yeah.
I think that's across the board. Our members, they don't have the money to have big ticket prices. People are reluctant to sit at a table of 10 in a hotel. There's just a range of things that are different. So we're looking at new ways of doing everything. So this one, for example, is going to be in the afternoon. It's going to be a 2-hour session, and it's going to be in a bigger space, and it's going to be a stand-up event. So you're not going to, be sitting down sharing croissants at breakfast. There's going to be the space to move, and numbers are going to be capped quite low as well. So every event that we do going forward, we're going to have to think through that event and figure a bespoke way of running it.
Yep.
So different venues, more outdoor spaces, more stand-up events, room for people to move rather than being all crushed up against each other, which they typically enjoy.
Yep.
So it's been very hard for us, and it will take a really long time until we are back to, if we ever do
Standard
get back
operating
to
procedure.
running 60 events
Yep.
a year. But we are
What's your feel on that?
hopeful running so many events.
Yeah, I mean,
So-
to what extent do you think? And I know none of us are really qualified to understand it, but you'll be closer to the significance of that with these business decisions.
So
what do you think?
do you think we will ever get back to that?
Yeah.
Or- I think it will take a very long time to do. The demand is there, but people, they ring me all day, every day, saying, when are we going to do this event? When are we going to do that event? I've got this great idea. Can we do something on this? I want to connect with these people. It's all about those connections. And so they really want to get back at it. But whether through physical restrictions, financial restrictions, I think it's just going to take a long time to get back to there. And it will probably never look the same as what it did.
No, I think that's...
And we
I think that's
pride,
clear.
the Property Council has always prided itself on having, a very schmick, professional look for its events.
Yeah.
The best AV and
Best events.
best speakers, best events,
Yeah,
best
definitely.
events. And so now we'll have to be satisfied with a bit less of all that.
Yeah. Yeah, again, without any expertise to make these judgment, to make these sort of observations, but I can't imagine that physically staggered events will be something that will remain, because I just don't think it's delivering the same value to the person that's going, whether that be going to see sporting matches or concerts or going to industry events or those sorts of things. So I either will get through it and forget about it, and through vaccines or whatever other means we'll feel more comfortable and we'll get back there, or perhaps there'll be increased sophistication in sort of technological things that can help us be safer in close proximity. And I think that bit is going to look quite different. So you go back 12 months and say, in 5 years' time, everyone's going to be wearing, I don't know, some kind of transparent mask that looks like whatever, like you probably see in various social media feeds. And you go, that looks crazy, I'd never do that. But, well, if it's a decision of wearing that and having the confidence to go back to doing what we used to do, or not being able to do them at all, then I think we'll probably do that. So again, I mentioned that I think laptops are going to start. Your new MacBook's going to have the best webcam and best microphone because people will be using that much more. I think there'll be enormous money being funneled into the advancement of these personal items, masks, whatever, that do those things more effectively. And I think that will, because I just can't imagine we're all going to be happy doing things that don't look something like we did before. Yeah. That's my hope.
Yeah, I think we've got to try and make them not feel too clinical as well. So,
but I think there'll be some concessions in that, and the social stigma associated with doing those things. Like if you go to Asia, everyone wears and has worn masks for a long time. If they're sick, they put a mask on. It's just no one bats an eyelid. But if anyone did that here, they'd be looked at oddly. So that breaking down those kinds of social stereotypes or reservations, I think, might happen more quickly. It's like, well, if I've got to get over that, but then I can still go and watch whatever sporting event or whatever, then I think I'll just choose to do that and get over it, and everyone will probably get over it. Yeah. That's my hope.
Or we'll just find a vaccine and we can...
Yeah, but
it's normal.
I don't know. I think there's got to be some residual concern about these things happening again, and whilst there can be some sympathy if you're sort of looking at sort of governments around the world generally to say, well, yes, they could and should have seen this coming, but really could anyone, until it really happens and it impacts you, it's often hard to make the investment you need to make that kind of change. I think there's very little excuse now going forward for us just to be asleep at the wheel on an ongoing basis. I don't know, again, that's my hope. I hope we're not. What about... so you're talking about your events in a physical context, and you spoke about having these virtual seminars with sort of important people in the profession that people want to hear from. You guys have a podcast series as well, something we spoke about many years ago from memory. But what other... I get the sense it needs to be more than that, not just for a business like the Property Council, but for any business that used to rely on that kind of social interaction of sorts. Are you guys cooking up any ideas, or are you seeing some really interesting things about how you can not only stage virtual events of whatever form, but also monetize those for,
to be honest, we in Queensland are pretty keen to shift away from virtual events because that's not the reason people attend our events. Early on, it was a health emergency. People wanted to find out what was going on. But if you look at the main reasons that people attend our events, it is to build their networks, business opportunities, thought leadership. A lot of that doesn't work well on virtual platforms. So we're basically, as soon as possible, shifting completely from virtual. We'll still use it for things like our committee meetings because we can't sit 20 people in a boardroom at the moment. But in terms of monetized events, our focus is back on the physical as soon as possible. And it is on the what next, because that is everyone's question, is the practical what next. So the landlords are saying, are people going to return to my building? Is it going to be, A and B team, in which case they still need the amount of floor space they've already taken, so that's cool. Is it going to be, people completely working from home? Are they going to be hubs popping up in the suburbs where people prefer to work? What does this...
Yes to that, I think.
What does this look like going forward? Public transport, active transport, these are the questions that they're all talking about now and the things that we're keen to talk about as well. But also, as I mentioned earlier, people's books were full. They're not so full going forward. So what are the actual here and now opportunities for work? So what are the big projects that are still going to continue on? Is government stimulus going to continue? What's it going to look like? Where is it going to land? How can people gear themselves up? So that's kind of where our events will focus face to face.
Interesting. Just one thing that you mentioned, your city's committee before. It strikes me that, whilst that's been a growing area of significance in the industry generally, that will really be having its sort of watershed moment. You just mentioned a couple of the things there, but it does go beyond, the micro questions about how people interact with a particular building into much more macro questions about transport and planning and, different locations, different methods of work.
Open space, people's changing priorities. And people have decided, not everyone, but a lot of people have decided that they can and want to stay within their suburbs. They don't have to go into the city. So we want them to, but they don't have to anymore. So what does that then look like for your city going forward? Like you said, planning implications, transport. Our members own all the CBD assets. What does that mean for them?
Yeah, I think an interesting space is, because shopping centres are a natural suburban hub. Transport is built around them, density is built around them, facilities are built in and around them. And, some retail assets have had office built adjoining, above, or whatever. It's never really been a massive thing in the suburbs. I do wonder whether that comes back on the agenda.
For a long time, council was keen to have residential above some of these big suburban shopping centres. The same as we have in lots of places overseas, and there was never the market for it. Like you say, does that change now? Yeah.
One thought I had in that respect, because when you look at retail, I think cinemas are a really interesting sort of subcategory within retail. Like that, without the pandemic, that was an industry in serious decline for a lot of reasons, and this is really making life an awful lot harder. And the location and extent of those spaces within shopping space, so they're not just big, but they're also isolated typically. And you wonder about those as, are they opportunities for co-working kind of spaces to be? Is that an in and out, like as one goes down, one comes up? I think one of these crazy thoughts that entered my mind.
Something will come up.
I think so. Jen, this has been fun. Thank you. As you would know, being an avid listener of the podcast, I do ask one question at the end about what is your current obsession, which is, what thing outside of work and family, and there may be nothing, you're a busy woman, what thing outside of work and family would people not know about you? What kind of thing really captures your interest, takes your fancy? Could be something very small, could be something very big.
I think people would know it if they know me. I live on acreage and I absolutely love being outside and in my garden and with nature. I love birds. We have lots and lots of birds. Any spare minute I have is getting my hands dirty out in the yard.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Thanks, Alistair.